Good morning. Today is Thursday, January 19th, 2023. It's 9 a.m. and this is a meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're continuing our work on S5, the short title of which is the Affordable Heat Act. And this morning we're talking with Mr. Richard Power and Mr. Jared Duval. So both of whom had a lot of experience with the development of this rule, and that's that can help us understand I said rule on my way back now, sir. The bill and the thinking behind the design of the bill. So with that, Mr. Power, good to see you again. Thank you for coming in.
Good morning. As you know, as I always say, it's a pleasure to be here. I work for an organization, the Regulatory Assistance Project, that advises governments all over the world. And this is my favorite place to be. I have great admiration for the Vermont legislature, and it's a privilege to be here. As by way of background, before I joined the Regulatory Assistance Project, I was the chair of what is now the Public Utilities Commission, and been working on energy and climate issues for quite a long time. It's nice to see you. For a while. I'd like to draw your attention to the title of the first slide. Vermont's thermal future, affordable and clean. And the reason I'm saying that is that it's important that we keep in mind that our goals here are to improve the affordability of Vermont's heat bills and to improve the environmental performance of the heating services that we consume in Vermont. You have in front of you legislation that can save Vermonters $2 billion on their heat bills, on actions that could be taken by 2030, and in addition, deliver $3 billion in environmental and social benefits. And by improving the buildings that we live and work in and the heating systems that serve them. And so that's the good news. You have legislation in front of you that would actually put us on that path. Now, if we could go to the next slide.
Sorry.
That's okay. The next slide is about the difficulties of getting there. As we often, observe in the climate world, fossil heat may be our toughest climate challenge. It's a large fraction of Vermont's climate emissions, over a third. Large reductions are required. And you've heard this from other witnesses, I'm sure, that we're looking to be on a pathway, and we have established requirements in Vermont to be on that pathway to meet our climate goals. We need to maintain a focus on equity because lower income households have higher energy burdens and less efficient housing and higher expensive heating sources. And in Vermont in particular, as you all know, the housing stock is old. There's a lot of improvements that would need to be taken. And the turnover rate is slow. This is not like the automobile fleet that turns over maybe in 12 or 15 years. The housing fleet, so to speak, turns over every, 120 years? In Vermont, I live in a house that was built in 1840. Lots of people live in older homes. And finally, solutions have to be taken by individual consumers, individual building owners and homeowners. So this is not something that you can you roll out of the factory and, truck into Vermont. This is not something you can put at the other end of the transmission line and say, oh, great, we now have renewable electricity, and you and I at home didn't have to do anything. So these are distributed decisions, kitchen table conversations. We need to come up with a mechanism that helps people around those kitchen tables to make those decisions. Next slide. You will see slides like this quite a number of times, I think. Fossil heat is not only expensive, but it's a roller coaster. And this slide is a little bit out of date, actually. If we were showing you fuel oil and propane this year, I think it would be, the numbers are, $2 a gallon higher than on this chart. But if you look at the bottom of this chart, it's kind of a busy chart, but at the very bottom of it, you see these relatively flat lines that are showing you the cost of heat from heat pumps, wood pellets, and wood chips, and compared with the much higher and much more volatile prices of fossil fuels higher on the list. So we are trying to bring the Vermont mix closer to the bottom of this chart, away from the top. We are, compared to the rest of the United States.
May I interrupt?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I have weak cones and rods, and I don't see colors very distinctly. So even though there's a key, I'm actually not able to read it. What is this? This is the bottom line.
The very bottom line is commercial wood chips. The next, what is the very bottom line? It's it's time. It's the
Oh, no, I know the graph.
Yeah, on the graph, it's wood chips, commercial wood chips, then dry wood chips, the second one up. The third one up is food pumps, and then the fourth one, a little more jagged, is wood pellets, but those are all the four bottom ones.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's fine. Don't please interrupt me at any time, of course. So the principal point, as I said, is to move us off of expensive imported fossil fuels towards heating sources that are both better for the environment and better for everybody's pocketbooks. We are, compared to the rest of the country, next slide, dependent on fossil fuels for heat, much more than the rest of the country. Sometimes Vermonters are surprised to learn that, hey, not everybody else is like us. We have only 24% natural gas, pipeline gas. The rest of the country is 49%, double what we have. In Massachusetts, it's triple what we have. The point of this particular slide is just to remind us how dependent we are on imported fossil fuels to heat our buildings. Next slide. So the legislation, Portable Heat Act, focuses on the creation of a clean heat standard. And I'm going to take you through the basic elements of a clean heat standard, what it is, and then touch on a few of the interesting design challenges that were built into it. I'm sure other witnesses, I'm leaving a lot of room for other witnesses to fill out a lot of the details. What is clean heat standard? So the essential point here is that it is a performance standard that requires heat providers, importers, principally, to deliver a gradually increasing percentage of low emission heating services to customers. The idea here is to convert the heating businesses in our state from ones that are delivering commodity fossil fuels to ones that are delivering lower costs and lower emission heating services. And if you're looking for examples, we do have two good examples right at hand about a performance standard. That is, the renewable portfolio standard is a performance standard. It doesn't require individual consumers to buy a certain amount of renewable electricity. It requires the providers to provide it. The same thing is true for energy efficiency services. That's a performance standard on the regulated utilities and the efficiency utility to deliver those services to Vermonters. And Vermonters aren't required to participate, but they have the opportunity to do so. So what would the clean heat services be that would be required to be delivered under a performance standard? We have designed this program. And this legislation, I commend the legislation, the drafters, to offer a variety of options to consumers and to the providers. We're not in this legislation just choosing our preferred technology and saying, okay, everybody's going to be required to do that. We recognize there are a lot of different things that have to happen. Weatherization, electric heat pumps, low emission fuels are all clean heat resources that qualify under the performance standard. Next slide. I guess I should speed up. I've mentioned that we in Vermont have experience with performance standards. And so it's one of the reasons why when we were, many of us came together to try to figure out how to address the thermal problem, we looked around for examples that would provide guidance. And performance standards in Vermont obviously are important. Provide guidance, but also performance standards around the country do the same thing. Now, as you probably are aware, we've been talking about renewable standards. 30 states have them. There's a lot of experience with them. Quite a number of states have efficiency performance standards, and more directly related to the work of this bill, low carbon fuel standards for transportation fuels provide a lot of information that help us. Those are in place in California, Washington, Oregon. The clean heat standard has been reviewed really carefully by the Vermont Climate Council, and also in Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Climate Plan. And now the Commission on Clean Heat in Massachusetts is calling for a clean heat standard there as well. Colorado has adopted also a pipeline gas standard.
So is Massachusetts roughly at the same place that we are, or are we likely to, if this passes this session, are we likely to be ahead of them?
We will be ahead of Massachusetts in adopting legislation.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Next slide. I could have said this at the very beginning, but I'll say it here. The Clean Heat Standard is the single most important recommendation of the Climate Action Plan. And I am a member of the Vermont Climate Council that participated in that decision, and I want to be really clear about it, that we thought, the Climate Council thought about this. We made a strong recommendation to the legislature last year. In fact, I left off of this slide our recommendation that this legislation be adopted by May of 2022. I hope that we can say it was adopted by May of 2023. So I have been asked the question, why not a carbon tax? I mean, there are a lot of different approaches around the world to dealing with climate pollution. And I want to share with you my experience and the experience of the legislature with respect to that question. In 2019, the legislature commissioned a study on the question of whether Vermont should adopt a climate or carbon tax, particularly for the purposes of dealing with transportation and heating fuels. And because on the electricity side, we already participate in a climate program called RGGI, and we have the RPS and the efficiency programs already going. The Resources for the Future study revealed that the impacts of a carbon tax would be relatively small, that if we imposed a carbon tax of $100 a ton, which is, by way of comparison, RGGI is currently selling, at that time was selling, RGGI allowances were selling for about $3 a ton, and today they're $13. So this would be a relatively high carbon tax in national terms. It would reduce emissions by just 10%. And the reason for this, I think it's intuitive, but I really want to kind of make sure the point is clear, that the market barriers to making improvements in buildings, making changes in heating systems are very high. What economists call the price elasticity of demand, which is basically how does demand change when prices change? Price elasticity of demand in heating fuels is extremely low. It's like it's negative 0.2 generally. So you need a very high change in price in order to get a change on the ground in consumption. And you all know this. I mean, the price of oil just went up. How much in the past year? And even if the price stayed at that level, even the long-term price elasticity is pretty low. And it would take a really long time to reduce our emissions by very much. And plus, I mean, let me emphasize, the equity impacts of doing it that way are hard to accept. And
Why?
well, because if we just raise the price of fuel oil, it's regressive, and it's expensive. And so, and in different, I've done a number of studies like this, some in the US and some in Europe. We did a study, looking at European carbon prices. And there's another aspect to it, aside from the regressivity and just the direct consumer impact. The question is, how much does it cost consumers, folks, per ton of carbon avoided by the policy? So if you think of it that way, the goal is to reduce emissions. How much does it cost to reduce a ton from out of people's paychecks and their household budgets? And the cost per ton avoided, it turns out to be very high. The study we did in Europe, this revealed that if you relied on price alone, it would cost over 200 euros a ton to reduce a ton by price alone. And in the United States, in power markets, we've done similar studies where the cost per ton avoided is extremely high. So putting aside the RFF study that the legislature commissioned was reported, and I've quoted it here, considering both the consumer impacts and the inefficiency of the mechanism of using price alone to drive change. I have no trouble telling you that my recommendation personally would be don't rely on a carbon tax. And the Climate Council didn't go there. Climate Council went to a clean heat standard.
Senator Wing.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. So just to get a little clarity. We've had a few different definitions of what a carbon tax is floating around.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that you've separated out the fact that the clean heat standard is not by definition a carbon tax, and that carbon taxes can be very ineffective. And it sounds like, based on your testimony, that what we're doing with the clean heat standard is both not a carbon tax and more effective than a carbon tax. So I think it answers actually both sides of the equation, which is every now and again, Senator McCormick and I have folks who demand a carbon tax. And then we have in the same room someone who tells us that the concept of a carbon tax would upend their life entirely. So I really appreciate you spelling out and defining for us that this is both not a carbon tax and that a carbon tax would be ineffective and this is the right path forward. So I just wanted to highlight that and say thank you.
You said it better than I said it, so I can move on. But this is a question. Frankly, I'm happy to talk about this at any time. I've studied this, as I said, both in the U.S. and in Europe, and our experience nationally is that performance standards can deliver the results that you're looking for a lot more effectively than a carbon tax alone. Now, there are examples like RGGI, where there is a carbon cap and trade, with the revenue being recycled into the delivery of energy efficiency, which lowers the whole cost of the program. So there are improvements on pure carbon pricing that we could talk about. But as I mentioned here on the slide, if we were to envision a carbon tax to solve heating in Vermont, the question is, okay, you raise the money. If we're not just hoping that buildings will get fixed just because the price of oil went up, which I think is a slow and expensive hope, then somebody might say, well, let's just take their money and spend it wisely and help everybody improve their buildings. And here I just would like to make the point that when you contemplate that, the only way that works at all is if you think about creating the Vermont Thermal Authority, hand them a pile of money, have them go around and do all this work, or commission all this work. And again, the Clean Heat Standard is designed to keep the government out of the heat supply business and to encourage private sector to do that work. So, in a different place, in a different world, we might just, expect the government to do all this, but I don't think we do here.
So keeping the government out of it and having the private sector do it seems like a more palatable approach. What I wonder about though is that making the private sector do something it doesn't want to do might be more onerous to them than having the government do it.
Well, later when we talk about the structure of the bill, I'm going to note that there are some fallback provisions in this legislation for those obligated entities who might not want to do this work, how they can make payments to a default service provider. And you can think of this as being akin to Efficiency Vermont, or an entity that could do some of this work for those. Let's just take, suppose that some fuel dealer doesn't want to be in the clean heat business. They want to stick with their old business model, and that's all they want to do. Then there's a fallback provision in the legislation. The legislation also gives clean heat credits to the existing programs, actually to anybody, to a HVAC provider or the Community Action Agency doing the weatherization program. Those folks are getting will be able to earn clean heat credits and the work they already are doing. And they could receive funding from the obligated parties to just do more of what they already do. So there are a lot of pathways here. I don't envision that Irving Oil has to personally create the workforce to go out and weatherize homes. They can pay the CAP agency or an HVAC provider or somebody else to do that work. So if I can get into the architecture, it'll help to answer that question. Into the next slide. So when you are considering this legislation, it will be helpful to you, in my opinion, to think about this architecture, the essential elements of a clean heat standard. And
You're at the next slide.
okay. Thank you. I don't want to just sit here and read these 7 elements, but I do think of it as an architect might. I'm designing a building. I need to make sure all the elements are there. What are they? And what is the obligation? Who's obliged? How fast do they have to make change happen? How to promote equity? What counts? And there are then special questions about, are there certain resources that we feel really strongly that ought to be provided or ought not to be provided as part of this transition? And those topics come up quite a lot, and you're certain to hear about them. Moving on to the next slide. I've been asked this question a lot, actually, because we've talked about clean heat standards in other places, and people say, well, what is the obligation? In the United Kingdom, one of my colleagues is working with the government, and the government basically says, well, we want to do a clean heat standard, but we don't want to count tons. What we want to count is heat pumps. We just want an obligation on manufacturers to manufacture heat pumps instead of furnaces or gas boilers. And they're a country, so regulate imports, and so they have a better chance of doing that than we do. But they're scratching their heads about that. I just give that as an example that you could create a clean heat standard that measures something other than tons. But in Vermont, one of the principal purposes of the clean heat standard is to reduce climate pollution, and therefore we do want to measure tons. And so I'm just making a point here that is how this program is designed. It measures tons and not square feet of insulated space or kilowatt hours consumed by heat pumps or any other way that we might measure this. We want the common currency of the clean heat standard is avoided tons of lifetime GHG emissions.
Measured in tons.
Measured in tons, right. That's the common currency. So all these different technologies have impacts with respect to reducing fossil emissions, and they get converted into lifetime GHG emission reductions.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Fossil emissions or carbon emissions?
Well, carbon emissions from fossil consumption. But when we measure the alternatives, I want to be clear, we're measuring lifetime greenhouse gas forcing emissions. Methane, for example, is also a carbon pollutant. And to make methane equivalent to carbon dioxide, you would need a conversion. So, but they're both converted to carbon dioxide equivalents.
But it's not, but we are looking at as well at carbon sourced from non-fossil.
Yes.
When specific, I'm thinking about wood.
Yeah, we're thinking about lifetime. when carbon credits or clean heat credits are awarded, they are awarded on a lifetime GHG equivalent basis. So that includes the lifetime emissions associated with diesel fuel, lifetime emissions associated with wood heat, lifetime emissions associated with biofuels, electricity, whatever it is, it's common currency.
So it's carbon, not just sequestered carbon.
Correct. Right. So, all right, the essential elements here. The focus is greenhouse gas emissions. The obligated parties are fossil fuel importers. That includes Vermont Gas, the pipeline company, and it includes the importers of fossil fuel. It's not designed to focus on retail fuel providers, the mom and pop fuel dealers that you often hear about. It's unless they are directly importing fuel themselves. Most of the fuel that comes into Vermont is brought into Vermont by much larger importers. And finally, credits are earned by actions at customer locations that reduce emissions. We're not giving credits under this scheme. Lots of cap and trade schemes give credits for offsets, plant trees, and weeds, loosely might say, plant trees in China and get an offset or whatever. That is not part of this legislation. There are no credits for offsets. We're only giving credits for actions that happen in Vermont at customer locations. Next, I'm just going to share with you the goals that the Clean Heat Working Group has been working with as this program has been. It's important to understand that, like a lot of public policy issues, there's not a single objective. You're trying to optimize among a variety of sometimes competing, sometimes synergistic objectives. We have designed this program, and this legislation has adopted a design. Actually, when I say we have designed it, it's a very big collective we. People have put their minds to this. The legislature has itself added a lot of features to this bill, and this version of the bill includes features that sponsors have added to improve it from where it was last year. So we want to be clear about that. Probably witnesses will come here and urge you to look at this rough square, which I've roughly drawn. And they're going to talk about one or the other of the corners of the square. And I'm just letting you know that the design of the program is really hard to optimize among them all. Climate accountable, achievable, equitable, and affordable. We really are interested in designing a program that actually in Vermont actually could help building owners to improve the heating systems and improve their building shells and therefore lower climate pollution. And it's not a theoretical proposition. This is something that actually has to happen in tens of thousands of, as I said, kitchen tables and boardrooms. So going to the next slide, you'll see that I've just taken the same thing and shown the arrows. Some people want faster and deeper greenhouse gas reductions. Some people will, we all want all of these things, frankly. We also want more support, as much support as possible for low-income households. We want to lower the total heat bill for the whole state. And we want to allow we don't want to open the door to clean, allegedly clean heat options that aren't really clean. And so these are all legitimate goals. And what you need to understand is that if you put your finger on one corner of that square and you pull it too far, the other corners have to squeeze in, and you're making a trade-off. And way I read this legislation, the bill drafters have tried really hard to optimize among all these goals. And I'll just alert you to the fact that if you were to decide to change them, you're probably making trade-offs. You just need. Now I'm going to proceed more quickly. What kinds of actions will earn credits? I touched on this earlier. There are a lot of possibilities for earning credits, starting with weatherization. I mean, the big ticket items really here in terms of solutions are going to be weatherization and heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. They're also important, but likely to provide a smaller fraction of the total answer would be some eligible biofuels, low carbon district heating, advanced wood heat. And at the very bottom, we have added that, renewable hydrogen is a theoretical possibility, and for some industrial applications, it's where you need really high temperature heat. It's something that's possible to happen. A lot of people think it will happen. I don't know if it will happen, and the legislation allows it to compete if it shows up and there are customers who want to buy it. An interesting feature of this legislation is that anyone can earn credits. I mean, some people think, well, if the obligated parties are obliged to do something, does that mean that only the obligated parties, only the fuel dealers can go out and do something to earn credits? The answer is absolutely no. That what we want to do is open a wide door, allow a heating contractor, a community action agency, Efficiency Vermont, a fuel dealer to earn credits, and in addition to obligated parties. And so we create the opportunity for lots of people to enter this field. And since we know that we need a couple 100,000 kitchen table conversations, and we need workers to be actually doing work in 200,000 or 300,000 locations, it's really important to imagine a variety of actors out there in the world actually doing this work.
Including the current fuel dealers.
Including the current fuel dealers, should they choose to change their business model, as some have.
This is a point about which I'm interested. Can you speak at all to the management of that?
Sure. I mean, a little bit later, I'm going to talk about that.
Oh, okay, never mind.
All right.
I'll hold my thought.
It's a really good question. All right. So let's go to the next slide. How many fuel switches do we need? This is an older slide from Energy Action Network publication, but it illustrates the point that we need. And many pathways can be modeled. If we create a clean heat credit opportunity, we don't really know how many Vermonters are going to choose heat pumps, how many might prefer a pellet stove, how many might want to spend their money on weatherizing, insulating the attic, or putting in the windows or whatever instead. We don't know. So I don't want to sit here and say, oh, here's what's going to happen. Different pathways involved. But what we do know is that in order to achieve at least an 88% reduction in thermal pollution by 2050, we're going to need to do something in almost every building in the state. So when you see these numbers up 250,000 weatherization jobs or heat pumps, and you compare it to a world in which we're doing 2,000 weatherization jobs a year, it emphasizes the steepness of the slope we must climb in order to meet our climate objectives. And I'll just take this opportunity to mention, the good news is that after we do that, we're going to be saving billions of dollars on our fossil heat imported. But it's still a challenge to get there. Okay, moving to equity. This is the Affordable Heat Act. I started off by saying modeling done for the Climate Council revealed that implementing these policies would save $2 billion over as a result of the measures that would be installed between now and 2030. And obviously more over time. And so that's great news, that it makes the Vermont heat bill more affordable over the long term. So you should feel, you should feel excited by the prospect of being able to deliver the savings to Vermonters. But while we do it, we need to make sure that the most energy burdened households in the state receive the services that they need to lower their heat bill. And they should be at the front of the line with respect to getting clean heat services. So the legislation does instruct the PUC in designing the program to emphasize the needs of the most energy burdened households, number one. It also mandates a high fraction of the savings to be delivered to low income and moderate income households in a way that protects the lowest income households in particular. And it also requires that those energy savings, at least half of those energy savings in those household categories, come from installed measures that will permanently reduce heating bills for those households. And so I just want to really put an exclamation point on the progressive and equitable aspect of this legislation that which has been improved since it was in the bill last year. It was always in contemplation of the legislature last year, but this year it is really underscored and made stronger.
Can I ask a quick question on that? I don't know that the bill names 16% of the measures must go to low income, 16 other 16% of moderate income. And just can you speak a little bit to where those percentages came from? You know, for instance, was there discussion around low income families being the most energy burdened? So let's put 50% of the effort into that tier. You know, like how do you decide what was an appropriate level?
So I'm happy to answer that question, but I know that Jared Duvall can give you chapter and verse on it. So either now or in a few minutes.
I'll wait.
Oh yeah, I think one important point is that it looks like 16 and 16, but actually since the residential sector is 16 and 16 of the entire program, residential is around 60% of all fossil fuel consumption in the state. So as a fraction of the residential sector, it's actually much higher. It's actually more than half of all savings would have to come from the those two categories. And they're separate, they're separated. Instead of just saying 32%, it said 16 and 15 because there was a concern, a legitimate concern, that if it just said 32%, that perhaps too much of it would come from moderate income and not from the lowest income. And so the ring fence around the low income is quite intentional.
My take from all this is that if you're a low Vermonter that bill, there's relief in the bill as opposed. I think some folks have characterized it as just anticipated higher costs. Instead, the bill aims to provide assistance to people at that level and reducing their costs. And it's explicit about it this year.
That's correct. And absolutely correct. And I mean, one of the thoughts that's been with me from the beginning is essentially, as I said, we know we need to treat virtually every building in the state. So if we know we're going to do that, why shouldn't we start with the homes that where folks are most energy burdened and where it's hardest changes? And so it's not 100% in that category, but because we know, I mean, the flip side of it is we still need to do everybody else.
Yeah.
We still need to go to the rest of the buildings too. So, okay, next design feature, which I'm going to touch on briefly because I know you're going to hear about this from other witnesses, which is accounting for biofuels. As mentioned a little earlier, most modelers expect that biofuels will be over time a relatively modest fraction of the total heat switches that we're going to make. But for some very good reasons, as part of the transition, low emission biofuels can provide a partial answer. And I think other witnesses are going to talk about this in more detail. So I'll pass on some of the really interesting and important details, but I would emphasize that in S5, there are a number of guardrails, seat belts, airbags, protections to ensure that only the high quality, low impact biofuels would be earning clean heat credits under this program. And I'll leave it at that, and I'm really happy to talk about it at any time. But I applaud the guardrails and airbags that are in this legislation. And I don't hesitate in saying that if other states are thinking about doing a clean heat standard, that this provides a very good model for them. Senator Watson asked about administration. And so the next slide touches on that. We did think long and hard about what agency in government responsible for administering this program, and concluded that it is similar enough to other performance standards. It's in the energy sphere, and expertise is greatest at the PUC and the Department of Public Service. We have in those programs, because they administer the renewable standard, they administer energy efficiency, they administer the Tier 3 program, which you probably are aware of, that actually is itself a precursor to this, because it obliges regulated utilities to reduce fossil emissions. They administer all those programs, and they have experience with how to do it. And so we looked at how they how they run those programs. They have technical, something called a TAG, a technical advisory group, that advises them on questions like, well, what are the savings expected to be from an energy efficiency measure? And are those savings adding up to meet the obligation of the utilities under the efficiency mandate? There are 1,000 technical details. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard from the TAG, but I as a former regulator, used to hear evidence of these things. And I'm enough of a nerd that I have to say it's really fun.
Sorry, if you have more on this side, I don't want to interrupt.
Oh. So the other important point is that in this legislation, it would also create an equity advisory group as well as a technical advisory group. The equity advisory group details are well spelled out to ensure that the needs and perspectives of communities that often overlooked in these conversations and lower income Vermonters would also be present in the decision making and in the program design and implementation. And that is another important feature of the legislation.
And one helpful thing in the evolution of this bill is that it grew up at the same time that we were having much more in-depth conversations about environmental justice. I think those principles have flowed into this bill as well.
So can we go back one slide here? So thinking about the technical advisory group and appreciating that a technical advisory group manages tier 3 right now. The difference in my mind is that for tier 3, there's sort of a pretty well-defined group of entities that they're working with. And this could be like thousands of entities. So it's kind of a whole like scale change in terms of like managing the credit awarding. So I just want to recognize that. So that's one, if you could speak to that a little bit, that would be helpful.
Yes.
And then the other thing that's on my radar is, so I mean, I sort of run through this as in like examples in my head, right? And knowing that anyone could potentially be someone that generates a credit, more or less. So, you know, when I think about installation of heat pumps, right? So is it the seller or is it the installer that generates the credit, or is it the owner that has generated the credit? So is it the vision that the technical advisory group or the PUC or the rule, LCAR, or, some part of the rulemaking would make the decision about, because it can't be all of those people. But someone's got to decide. So if you could speak to that as well.
Okay. Thanks. Those are great questions. I heard two questions. And
Yes.
So the first one is the multiplicity of actors. I've made, I think, a strong argument about why we need a multiplicity of actors. So we need to figure out how to make that work. And the example that comes to mind for me is efficiency programs in Vermont. Efficiency Vermont, I mean, there is a tag that decides how much credit to give to a certain kind of measure. And based on the evidence, based on a lot of evidence, frankly, frequently. And so there's this sort of technical decision that gets made. But then the question is, well, who's going to be delivering those measures out in the world? Efficiency Vermont has a program where they certify approved contractors whose work practices they trust, who are able, or authorized to go out and deliver the measures. They check up on them, and they do a lot of efficiency programs nationwide do this. They do a random audit of installed measures, and they try to see, well, are you still doing a good job? You're still qualified to be on our contractor list, et cetera. And so that's a pretty long list. Personally, I envision that the PUC would establish something like that for certifying installers who are able to deliver credits. Now, the second part of your question is, sorry, who owns the credit? And in my world, it's the end use customer who actually owns the credit. And what they do with the credit is basically a matter of negotiation with the installer or some other entity that may be working with the installer. And the expectation is that the installer says to the homeowner, hey, I can give you a discount or a rebate on installing this heat pump, but you have to give me the credit if you want the rebate. And the customer doesn't have to take it. It's a private decision whether they do it or not. But that's exactly what happens today with the rebate programs that we already have in the state for heat pumps, for wood pellet stoves, or what have you. That's how we do it today. That one does not keep me up at night. That
Okay,
one-
well, that's good. I'm just thinking logistically. Cool, thank you.
Now, we start out with the idea that the supplier is the obligated party. The supplier has to develop these credits, has to do things worthy of the credits.
That's correct.
How does the end customer end up with it?
The supplier has to acquire credits and retire them.
Retire them by
Giving them to the
customer.
basically.
To the government
well,
or to the customer?
So ultimately, they have to buy them from the customer. Basically, as I just said, imagine the usual rebate mechanism. So I'm a contractor working for an obliged party. I come to you and say, I'm going to help you install a heat pump. And I'm offering a rebate of $700, $1,000, whatever it is. I'm offering a rebate. And will you install the heat pump? And the customer, this program is set up to allow individual Vermont customers to either say yes or no. They say, no, I don't want a heat pump. I'd rather have a pellet stove, or I'd rather spend my money putting in insulation. We're not obliging individual customers, to take a particular action. But that's just as with Efficiency Vermont today, just as with Tier 3 today. That's a private decision. So a credit is generated by the action. So the heat pump is installed and a credit is created. The customer owns it, but probably in return for the rebate, they gave it to the installer. The installer now has the credit. If the installer is Vermont Gas, they're an obliged party. They take the credit and retire it because they're obliged. It goes in the credit bank or because it's a delivered savings. And if they're not an obliged party, now imagine you're an HVAC contractor and you have credits. So then they're worth something in the market. You go to Irving, or you go to Vermont Gas, or you go to any other obliged party, and you say, I've got credits, do you want them? How much are you willing to pay? And the obliged parties are required by this legislation to acquire those credits from somebody. Either they can do it themselves and earn credits, or they can buy them from the contract. And that creates value in the credit market that helps to ensure the delivery of measures. That if I have, I've tried to make it only three parties. There's the customer, the installer, and the obliged party. And the obliged party needs credits. Customers can take actions to create credits.
Based on your experience elsewhere, is it possible, likely, not so likely, that someone out there will see an opportunity to aggregate credits, buy them to customers with the measures, and then make them available to someone else who has an obligation?
Sure. Yeah. In fact, I mean, think about what happens with renewable energy credits. There's kind of a fluid market in those credits, and aggregators make a business by buying them and making them available. This particular market doesn't exist right now, but Tier 3 exists. Efficiency Vermont exists. We have rebate programs that are working just fine.
Quick question. How much,
I think
2025.
okay, great. Just keeping an eye on the clock for all of it.
okay.
Senator Watson.
So for technology that has both a seller and an installer, and those two entities might be different, I assume that there'll be some kind of traffic control as to like how that negotiation work, like, because we can't have both the seller and installer both taking credit for the same
Correct.
tech.
And that's true today for efficiency.
Okay.
Right? We only count them once.
Okay, cool, thank you.
I think I should wrap up here because I know that Mr. Dwell has plenty of good observations to leave with you. Happy to come back at any time to answer your questions, but I'm going to now just wrap up with a conclusion slide that emphasizes the main points about why I am happy to support this legislation and commend the chairman and the members for I think it's a really good bill. The basic point is that we need a policy driver to make change happen. And we're not going to reduce, we've been suffering from high fossil fuel bills for decades, and we've been responsible for high greenhouse gas emissions from those by burning those fuels. I mean, it used to drive me crazy to think that we were spending roughly $1 billion a year to import carbon that we didn't even want to emit. You know, it just seems like we ought to be able to stop this. And we need a policy driver that would do it. I'm convinced that incentives alone will be too slow. We can't envision possibly just creating a public fund that's going to pay for all this work. And businesses, I mean, there are business opportunities galore out there in delivering clean energy services, delivering weatherization, delivering cleaner fuels. But the businesses that would deliver those things need to see a path. They need to know the market will exist for them in the future. We're building in equity, and which is super important. And we're not picking technology winners. You know, when I look back at the history of the renewables obligations, or the efficiency obligations for that matter. And I, and I can say this personally because as a regulator, I was involved in creating those obligations. And I'm really glad we didn't just pick winners. We didn't just try to guess what's the price of PE going to be compared to the price of wind, compared to the price of Rex from Maine or whatever. We created a renewables market with some competing resources. And I think that's what we're doing here in this legislation. And that's also important because, particularly because it's Vermonters individually who need to decide what they want to do in their homes. I don't envision that the legislature, I mean, it's possible that the legislature could decide, no, everybody's got to have X. That's what we're doing. It's a requirement. Frankly, I just don't see that happen. And I frankly don't think it should happen because choice matters, number one. And number two, change is going to happen. Whatever you think, whatever I think today about the best technology, 5 years from now, there'll be something else.
Thank you, Chairman. Just one question for you that I think might be implicit in your testimony, but I want to see if we can make it explicit, which is if we continue to wait and not pass a policy like this, the requirements that I expect that we'll need to ask individuals to make will be stricter and more regressive. Like the longer we wait, the harder we're going to have to squeeze to actually get the results that we want to even have a minuscule impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. I'm wondering if you feel like that is accurate and what your concerns are if we don't pass a policy like this now, and if it will become worse if we wait.
I know you will hear this also from Mr. Duval. I feel a sense of urgency, not just because of global climate impacts growing, but because the longer we wait to get this program going, the harder it will be to succeed.
Yes.
And yeah, I think waiting would be a big mistake, Mike.
Thank you very much.
But thanks for allowing me to be with you.
Great to see you again. With that, let's hot bunking here.
And I should offer my apologies to Jared because
So Mr. Paul, please join us. Good to see you again. Good to see you for a day. You're putting on a different hat. See you.
Do you enable screen sharing?
Can you send me a copy of the slide?
yeah, if you.
Good morning, Chair Bray, members of the committee. Glad to be with you again. As you noted, I am here today in my capacity as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, which I was appointed to by the Senate Committee on Committees, and where I co-chair the Science and Data Subcommittee, sit on the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee that Richard co-chairs, and also serve on the Council's Steering Committee. Go ahead and share my screen. So Rich did a wonderful job going over broad architecture key components of the Affordable Heat Act. There's just a couple of things that I want to emphasize or add a little bit more detail to. The first is, it cannot be stressed enough. I know you've heard it before, but the point I see, the overriding point of this bill, when I read it, and I've read it many times, the goal is to help Vermonters reduce heating costs by getting off of this fossil fuel roller coaster that has been hurting folks and families for far too long. The idea of having to spend, as you said, Chair Bray, $2,000 or $4,000 more out of your family budget in economic times like this, and that is not new. The price volatility and the high costs of fossil fuels are a feature, not a bug in those markets. So that's number one. The second is that, as you were just saying, Senator White, early action leads to more affordability and savings than later action. I shared this slide yesterday. This is the summary of the marginal abatement cost curves report that was conducted for the Vermont Climate Council by Energy Futures Group, Cadmus, and the SEI. And what you see is on the left-hand side of this graph are the measures that it's not a cost to reduce a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. You are saving money at the same time. It is a win-win in reducing pollution and reducing costs. And the measures, the actions that reduce costs the most, that save people the most money in this modeling, all of those on the left-hand side are thermal sector measures: heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, building shell improvements through weatherization, advanced wood heat, clean cooking. That is, and you can save, a lot of those have long-lived measures. You weatherize a home and you can reduce a bill for 25 plus years. You put in, cleaner heating equipment that can reduce your bill for a long time. So the sooner we act, the more we can help people get off of that fossil roller coaster and maximize those savings. Again, not new, but incredibly important. You charged us with a legal responsibility to deliver a plan, the Climate Action Plan, that can meet the requirements established in the Global Warming Solutions Act. The Clean Heat Standard was by far the #1 pollution reduction policy recommendation in that plan, and there is no way that the Climate Action Plan adds up by 2030 without it. I want to emphasize something that Richard said, is that this recommendation was not come to lightly. There were years of deliberation, first in the Clean Heat Working Group and then in the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, assessing this policy option against others. Richard outlined very well the reasons why the council, it's first the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, preferred a performance standard approach, the Clean Heat Standard approach, to a carbon tax. And I think that could be best summarized as the evidence from across the country, from across the world, is that carbon taxes are very good at raising revenue. They're not very good at confidently reducing emissions. Our goal is not to raise revenue. It's to reduce pollution and save people money while we do that in a progressive rather than regressive way. But I also want to note that there were some other policy ideas that were floated that we saw having major drawbacks, and were reasons that we didn't recommend them as well. So one idea that got brought up was, well, we already have a governance structure for our regulated utilities, the electric utilities. Why not just add to their responsibility list the responsibility for reducing emissions from the thermal sector as well? And I want to just briefly say why we thought that was a bad idea. That could be perhaps best summarized as, just expand Tier 3 to do all of the emissions reductions that we would need to do. I'm just going to skip to the end. Oops. In economics, in environmental economics, there's a principle known as polluter pays. And ideally, the folks that you want paying for solutions, paying for pollution reductions, are the ones creating that pollution. In Vermont, we're in right now an odd and problematic circumstance where, in terms of the amount of money that gets added to a bill, an electricity bill, or a heating bill, there's much more taxes and fees on electricity bills right now than there are on delivered fuels. You can see that on the left-hand side here. But the opposite is true in terms of who's creating the pollution, or what's creating the pollution. Heating oil, propane, natural gas are all far higher emitting. So the idea that we would say to utilities, your portfolios are 95% carbon free. You're 2% of Vermont's overall greenhouse gas emission, and you should have to undertake activity that you're going to have to find a way to pay for, that you're probably going to pass on to ratepayers. At a time when what we need to be sure we're doing is keeping electric rates low and as stable as possible if we're going to make the transition away from fossil fuels as attractive to consumers. That doesn't make any sense that you would put more obligation on an entity that is not responsible for the pollution and put upward price pressure on something that we want to keep as low as possible, the cost of electricity. So I just wanted to note that briefly to round out this kind of, we've looked at other policy options. There's no silver bullet, but and you know, in the judgment of those of us who voted on the climate action plan and first assessed this in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, I can't speak for everybody. It was the climate action plan that was adopted, included this as the #1 pollution recommendation. I will say for myself, carefully reviewed as a counselor other policy options, and this was by far the clean heat standard, which the Affordable Heat Act would establish, was by far the most appealing to meet those goals around confidently reducing emissions, reducing heating bills, advancing equity, and doing it all efficiently and cost effectively.
I think on an earlier presentation from Ken, I forget what you were squeezing. It was like, do you want to squeeze a grapefruit to get juice, or do you want to squeeze a grape? You know, we've already done all the squeezing on the electrical energy efficiency market. There's not that much opportunity left for that to have an impact.
And I don't want to suggest that there are not additional opportunities to reduce emissions in the electricity sector or via energy efficiency programs. There are, and that is worthy of exploration and advancement. But in terms of the moose on the table, the elephant in the room, where the most pollution and costs come from, it is the fossil fuels we use for transportation. So next, we just created, this is brand new, a graphic to help explain how does 16 plus 16 equal 30? Rich was talking about this. There is the requirement in this bill that 16% of the clean heat credits come from serving low-income households and 16% from moderate-income households. That is all of the credits representing all of the emissions reducing activity. However, when we talk about the thermal sector, you can think about it in 3 components. One is residential, one is commercial, and one is industrial. There aren't low income or moderate income customers in the commercial or industrial sector. So to get that 16% of the total, you can only get it from the 54% of thermal emissions that come from residential fuel use. And so, 16 divided by 54 is, it's 30%. And so that's how it's really, I think, better thought of, more accurately thought of as, 60% of the residential market, or at least 60%, would have to come from serving low and moderate income homes. And so the question, I think, I can't remember if it was Senator Watson or someone raised a very good question. How are those numbers arrived at? And one of this goes back to the shape of the solution space that Rich was talking about in terms of kind of cost effectively reduce emissions and equitably reducing emissions and trying to find a balance there. Our feeling, and this is reflected in the bill with Chair Bray's leadership, was that at a minimum, we want to make sure that a progressive share of clean heat credits and services go to low and moderate income folks. That there are more, because of energy burden, energy justice, and energy equity concerns, that the bulk of those clean heat services in the residential sector go to low and moderate income Vermonters. Also because there's more kind of disposable income and ability to make these choices on their own for upper income folks. At the same time, you don't want to so constrain the market, and generally, unfortunately, in order to generate a clean heat credit by serving a low or moderate income customer, the experience that we've seen from energy efficiency utilities from Tier 3 programs is that oftentimes you have to give 100% grant or a very high incentive. So the cost per credit, the cost per emissions reduced, is much higher. And so there needs to be this balance of equitable advancement, but not spiking the costs of the program to an untenable level. And so that was kind of, I don't think that there's an exact science or a perfect answer to the percentages and where that ends up. It was, I think the two considerations were wanting to make sure it's progressive, not regressive, and wanting to make sure that it was still technically feasible and possible from an implementation and technical feasibility perspective to actually do the work and deliver.
And the bill provides for opportunities to make adjustments as we learn from operating the program. So just smart, pay attention and learn from what's happening.
It's very important.
Great question. Sorry. I feel like I could probably just ask you this like later, because I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around some aspect of this. And I think it's just math that is like getting me right now. So 16%, just one more time.
Yeah.
16% comes from, comes from where?
Yeah, so it's 16% of that total pie of all, of the total pie has to come from serving low-income customers. But the low-income customers only exist in that green portion of the pie. And so it's 16% of the total, but that's really 30% of the residential market.
Okay, thank you. I think I get it now.
Sorry, no, it's confusing, especially when you're kind of melding two concepts into one pie chart.
So good.
Thank you, Chair Britt. And just to be clear, we don't have those kind of slicing the pie individually within the commercial or industrial sector. So this is unique to the residential sector. Okay.
So good.
That's the other confusing part.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Well, yes, please. And, we'll have, since we're all the time almost in here, we will keep doubling back till everyone feels like they've answered every question. So don't feel awkward or, like we have to pass anything over. We'll make the time. And if it's not right now, we'll circle back. Chair McCormick.
As a former teacher, there are different learning styles. My learning style is analogous to an old Polaroid picture coming into focus, which is that I get the whole picture immediately, but very, very vaguely, and then it gradually comes into focus. I know there are other people whose minds work differently. They get one line of detail on top of another, and eventually they get all the details, and that gives them the whole picture. So at this point, I get the whole picture. It's very vague to me right now, but I expect that over time, that's my work in this legislative session.
You have to shape the Polaroid.
I once threw a Polaroid camera at the wall. But, it ruined the whole party. But we don't just need to understand this. We need to understand it well enough to articulate it to our colleagues and to articulate it to a somewhat hostile public.
Yes.
My email is not supportive of this. I support it, I get the idea, but what I'm getting are scoldings.
Well, my happy story from Vermont is our experience with efficiency Vermont. $709 million invested, collected from Vermonters through this energy efficiency charges, $2.8 billion in savings by virtue of making that investment. So 20 years plus experience, we know how to run a large program that brings advantages to all of us through cooperation. So we're on the cusp of creating that.
Just a couple more slides, if that's okay.
Yes. So we just so we can go over a little.
Okay, I will try not to. So I wish, I think we all wish, that there were perfect energy solutions that were, cost nothing and had no pollution. Unfortunately, not many of those exist. And for those of us who feel a responsibility to, as we work towards a world that we wish existed, also operate with and understand the world as it exists now, and think practically about how this type of transformation will have to unfold in a way that respects the elements that Richard spoke to in terms of choice and meeting Vermonters where they are. There's a few things that I want to point out because they're really important from just a very practical level about Vermont homes and buildings and how Vermonters heat right now. This is a graph from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, their housing needs assessment. This looks at Vermont homes by the reported primary heating fuel that they use. I will note that this is different than the share of overall heating because it doesn't include commercial and industrial, and when you do, these percentages change. But for residential, you see 43% of Vermonters have a primary heating fuel that is fuel oil, and then the next is utility gas, and then propane and wood. And so what those add up to, those three bars on the left, is about over 80%, 80 to 85% of Vermont homes use a liquid or gaseous fuel that requires right now a furnace or a boiler, usually in their basement, to combust that fuel. So that's kind of the starting point. I think we all wish it wasn't the case, but that's the reality. Another reality, Rich spoke to this. This is a graph from the transportation energy profile that VTrans produces. And it shows that over an 11-year period, this is the distribution of vehicle age. So of all the registered vehicles in Vermont, here's their year of make. And every 11 years in Vermont, 70% of our vehicle fleet turns over. If you think about our heating equipment fleet, all those furnaces and boilers and water heaters that I just spoke about, less than half of that is going to turn over in 11 years. So we have to, this is even more challenging than the transportation sector because of the life of the equipment. And so, again, grappling with practical reality of meeting Vermonters where they are, there are a number of folks who've made investments in boilers or furnaces that burn fuel oil or that utilize fossil gas. And as long as those pieces of equipment are in existence, they're going to burn something, the unfortunate reality. So the practical question to me is, for folks who don't choose to tear out that system, who've made an investment and are kind of going to use it for some number more years, hopefully don't replace it with another fossil system, but for that remaining balance of years, the real question is whether you're using it for primary or you switch it to a backup or supplemental heat. Are you going to burn fossil fuel in that? Or are you going to burn a not zero emitting, but a lower emitting on a life cycle basis biofuel, B100 biodiesel, for it? So my house, backup heating is a oil furnace or a furnace that burns B100 biodiesel from recycled restaurant oil. If you look at the carbon intensity of that, it's a CI value of 20 compared to fuel oil, which is 100. So it's not zero, it's not perfect, but it's 5 times lower emitting than fuel oil. And so I think if we don't recognize that reality, if we just ignore it, then there's this perverse way in which it further embeds and advantages fossil fuel and leads to more fossil fuel use than would otherwise be the case. So do I like that there is going to need to be a use of biofuels in the near and medium term? Not necessarily, but I think the practical reality in terms of the numbers adding up is we need to allow for that opportunity. The other reason I would point to this is that EAN has done the modeling, the Vermont Climate Council has done the modeling. And the way that we start is you look at what are the technology adoption curves of all of these different things. How much weatherization are we doing? How many heat pumps are being installed? What's the projected supply chain? What's the projected workforce? And if you turn the dial as far as you can on the maximum number of heat pumps that we think we can plausibly install by 2030, you turn it all the way to the right. You turn the weatherization dial all the way to the right. You turn heat pump water heaters all the way to the right. We were not able to produce a model that any of us could feel confident about and stand behind that didn't have some remainder of heating that would still have to come from biofuels. Now, hopefully that declines over time. Hopefully the guardrails that have been, the intent of the bill last year, the implication of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions was always that biofuels that are more polluting than fossil fuels would never have been allowed, either in last year's bill or in this year's bill. But what this year's bill does even more clearly, explicitly, is create guardrails with the declining carbon intensity threshold that make sure that over time biofuels are being reduced and that the ones that are being used are as lower emitting as possible as compared to fossil. Unfortunately, I have learned so much from working with Richard, and one of the phrases that I know he and his colleagues often use, it uses the question, compared to what? And I think that addressing this responsibly, we always need to say, if we do want this, compared to what? If we don't want this, what's the alternative? And I will just end with, we talk about how this has been policies like this have been implemented in other states. This is a graph that we produced using data from the state of Oregon. And they have a very similar model to what is outlined in the Affordable Heat Act, establishing fuel pathways, measuring different fuels on those fuel pathways by their life cycle emissions. And so there's not one value for biofuels in terms of how much they emit. There's over 230 different values of carbon intensities for biofuels depending on how they're sourced, how they're produced. And some, like using recycled restaurant oil, like I do as my backup heat. You see that B100 biodiesel from used cooking, that green dot right there, that's a carbon intensity of 20. A B20 blend, 20% biodiesel with 80% fuel oil with soybean-based biodiesel. That's closer to 100 and would likely not be allowed, at least after 2030, given the way that the bill is right now. So I think that that's a really important kind of technical point in terms of different biofuels are not one size fits all. We need to follow the science and differentiate them using fuel pathways and life cycle analysis, and that's exactly what this bill does. So I just want to end, I know I'm a little bit over, by offering one reflection that I don't have a slide for, but the question has come up often about costs. I would say the question should be about costs and savings, and what can we know versus what we can't know. And we've heard a number of folks say, well, we need to wait to know what the cost of a clean heat credit would be, or what the impact on a gallon of fuel oil will be next year, or the impact of a price of a gallon of biodiesel next year. And what I would say is I'm not going to question the motives of people asking those questions, but what I know is that in a market-based program like this it is impossible to know the answers to that question until you set up the program. You can do modeling to try to assess a range, but when the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative was put up, we didn't know what the price per ton of carbon would be. When Oregon set up their clean fuels program, they didn't know what the price of a clean fuels credit would be. You can establish guardrails and circuit breakers in the bill to make sure that the PUC has the ability, if there are challenges in the market, to make sure that doesn't get too high. But I don't believe that's a knowable question. What is a knowable question about cost is this. We know that Vermont has a legal requirement to reduce these emissions, and that in doing so, we can save billions of dollars for Vermonters on their heating bills. We also know that we have a 2030 requirement, a deadline to hit to do that. If this bill does not pass this year, last year we were talking about 6 years to do that. Now we're talking about 5 years. Every year that we delay, it increases the challenge of doing that and increases the cost. So while we can't say with certainty what a clean heat credit would be, or what small percent of change in a minuscule cents per gallon, that's the experience in Oregon when they did their clean fuels program. It was a 5 cent a gallon impact on prices to get a massive reduction on just the fossil prices. They actually then saw the prices of a lot of other things go down. Biodiesel became less expensive and more attractive. That's the point, is to bring down the price and make more attractive the affordable options. But while we cannot know that, the exact price effect on any one fuel, there's so many market variables and dynamics. We do know that providing less time to meet a deadline will increase the overall cost. So if we're truly concerned about costs, we need to act sooner rather than continuing to delay.
Thank you, Chairman Gray.
We had the point made to us by Secretary Moore that the Oregon fuel standard, when they were going through it, they have retrospectively and have communicated to the Vermont administration that they wish that they had more data and that they needed fuel data that they didn't have at the time. And I'm not sure what the feelings were beyond that they felt in Oregon. I'd love to connect with someone there to get a sense of it. But I'm wondering if you could speak to, were they able to be successful with their program? Both because we have more data than they did when starting their program, and they also, it seems, are doing quite well with it. So.
Yeah, the Climate Council heard from, this committee heard last year from, and I've had frequent conversations. One of the most knowledgeable people on that policy is the program manager of the Clean Fuels Program in Oregon. Her name is Corey Ann Wind, and I would encourage the committee to have her back. And I think that the point you're making is exactly right. There is always more that we can do to get more refined data. This bill calls for that. It requires registration of the obligated parties so that we can have even better tracking. I think that that is a yes, and yes, we can do that, but it's not a reason to delay setting up the program.
Thank you.
So, for context, going with the idea, and I've said this, people know they're tired of hearing me say it, but that no plan is a plan. If we do not pursue this course, if we more or less stay on the course we're on, do we have any data on how much that's going to cost? I mean, any more solid data than what we have for this? We can figure it's going to go up.
I mean, I think that the short answer to that is the analysis that was done in that cost curves report. $2 billion higher if we continue to rely on fossil fuel and don't take all these actions.
Yes.
And I just want to say, I know if I may, just for 1 minute, I often come in here and speak with you all about data and modeling and analysis, and it's all kind of very head-based, right? But I think at the end of the day, I know I personally, and I think all of us, I think it's really important to pause and say, why are we really doing this? There's all the data and analysis and facts and arguments and rationale to support it. But I think there's two things that stand out for me. You know, we were speaking yesterday, Senator White mentioned, I mentioned, you know, what it's like growing up in a low-income family when you are, you know, moving from apartment to an apartment that's uninsulated and you have to set the heat below it that it is comfortable, and you're dealing with all the challenges that energy burdens create. If we're talking about true affordability, we're never going to get there with continued reliance on fossil fuel. It's like having a hole in your roof and just hoping that you'll stay dry, and then then it rains. Like, in order to actually fix the problem, or we have to actually get off of the fossil fuels, not just point out that they're expensive and that they're a problem. And then the other piece is a real moral piece in terms of the science and the argument that frustrates me the most, knowing our state's history. And I'm aware that I'm in the presence of a history teacher here, but throughout Vermont history, whenever there has been a major national challenge, the response of Vermonters has not usually been, let's go to the back of the line or let's shirk responsibility. It's, what can we do to do our part, to take responsibility, to, and sometimes make a sacrifice, I would argue in this situation, seize an opportunity. But people will say, well, Vermont is too small to make a difference. And of course, Vermont reducing our emissions is not going to change the global climate. We're not asking Vermonters to be responsible for other people's emissions. We're saying we should be responsible for our pollution. We should do our part. And that is even more of a moral imperative because historically, we have polluted a lot more than a lot of other places around the world that are going to see worse impacts from the climate crisis. And if you look comparatively around the region, we have the highest per capita emissions. So no, do we need to solve the climate crisis on our own or reduce other people's emissions? No, but we do have a legal responsibility, and I believe a deep moral responsibility to do it here, to do our part, and to show Vermonters, and to deliver for Vermonters a way to do that reduces costs, that improves affordability, and addresses deep-seated energy inequities that are not going to change as long as we continue to be dependent on fossil fuels. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And those homes will be more comfortable to live in. We have a lot of trouble pricing comfort, but having lived in both sorts of places, to not be cold at home perpetually is a huge relief. So